Hello, welcome to Protecting People's Rights in the Digital Age, a case for a Universal Declaration on Digital Rights. This session is part of the Skoll World Forum's Ecosystems Day and is wholly curated and hosted by Equality Now. I'm Nikki Kandari-Carrera, I'm the Director of Programs for Equality Now, and this event has been imagined and organised by Equality Now with women leading in AI. In short, Equality Now focuses on making sure the law works for women and girls, and is actually 30 years old today, so happy birthday to us. And Women Leaders in AI are a feminist network that are working to ensure that AI is responsible, transparent, and held accountable and governed well. We will have about an hour and 15 minutes for the meeting. The last 15 minutes will be open for discussions with our panelists, and the chat and Q&A functions are open and will be monitored by Equality Now. Please note that this event will be recorded. Okay, so let me kick off by setting the scene. The rapid expansion of digital technology is bringing extraordinary opportunities as well as profound disruption in our global society. As we accelerate into our digital future of fast-paced digital transformation, high internet speeds, algorithms, machine learning, Web3, the blockchain and the metaverse, and whatever comes next in this digital ecosystem, we're actually all acutely aware that this new ecosystem is reflecting, replicating, and indeed amplifying the biases and discrimination of existing structural inequalities in the physical world, such as racism and misogyny. Of course, it's not all bad. Online channels have created tremendous opportunities, not least for free expression, organizing, and collective action on a global scale, and for countering oppression. But rights-based freedoms are infringed upon. Existing discriminations and biases are being amplified. And old and new forms of violence and crime are perpetuated online in a globalized, multi-jurisdictional and barely regulated space with increasing impunity, as international and national laws and systems fail to keep pace with the technological advances of our age or their consequences. So today, our panel of experts will discuss why a bold, transformative, universally agreed and feminist-informed Declaration of Digital Rights will help ensure that the rights of all people, particularly those most vulnerable and those who suffer from discrimination, are protected in the digital space. This session aims to engage you in our efforts towards the development and adoption of this declaration. So first, let me introduce you to our panel. We have Tsitsi Matakai, who is the global lead of End Sexual Exploitation at Equality Now. She's a recognized legal expert on women's rights, sex trafficking, sexual exploitation, access to justice, women and political participation, and violence against women and girls. She moved to the UK from Zimbabwe as a Chevening scholar and earned a master's degree in human rights law. And she co-authored How Lifelong Discrimination and Legal Inequality Facilitate Sex Trafficking in Women and Girls, published in the Palgrave International Handbook on Human Trafficking. Welcome, Tsitsi. The next panelist will be Isidore Arababor, is Access Now's business and human rights lead. She works to promote human rights in the digital age, focusing on the responsibility of tech companies to respect human rights. She earned her Juris Doctorate in New York City and a master's in international business law in Madrid. So welcome, Isidore. Great to have you here. Nena Wakama is best known as Nena from the internet, and she's a champion for meaningful internet access, open data, open government, and the open web. She's one of the pioneers of West Africa and African internet governance forums and contributes as faculty in internet governance schools across the world. She previously was the policy director of the World Wide Web Foundation, and she's currently their chief web advocate. And she leads on their collaborative platform on 100 civil society organizations. She holds a master's degree in international relations and law and certificates in digital democracy, ICT policy, and e-diplomacy. So welcome, Nena. I'm really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Nikki.
Chennai Cha is the Special Advisor on African Muradi Innovation at the Mozilla Foundation. She's an expert on intersectional digital technology and gender. She has built her expertise through extensive experience in work, research, and public policy assessment, focused on understanding the impact of technology in society. You're really welcome tonight. And last, but certainly not least, is Ivana Bartoletti. who is the global head of privacy at Wipro. They're a leading international information technology consulting and business process service company. She is an internationally recognized thought leader in the fields of privacy, data protection, and responsible technology. In 2019, she was awarded Women of the Year at the Cybersecurity Awards. She's a visiting policy fellow at University of Oxford, where she focuses on global information sharing from the perspective of privacy, security, data protection, and human rights. She's the co-editor of the AI book, a handbook for investors, entrepreneurs, and fintech visionaries, and is the author of An Artificial Revolution on Power, Politics, and AI, which if you haven't read, you should read. It's amazing. And she's also the founder of this influential Women Leading in AI network. I'm absolutely delighted that you're here to join us, Ivana. Welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's kick off the conversation. Let's start with Sitsi. So Sitsi, how did the idea of the need for an intersectional, feminist-informed, universal declaration of digital rights, and that's a mouthful, how does that come about for Equality Now?
Yeah, thank you, Nikki. So the idea emerged from our learning over the years of working to advance the rights of women and girls across the world. Equality Now has been contributing to efforts to end violence and discrimination against women and girls globally for 30 years now. And as Nikki said at the beginning, today we are celebrating our 30th anniversary. Our main areas of focus are ending sexual violence, sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, harmful practices and discrimination in the law. We pride ourselves on being an adaptable and forward-looking organization. And throughout these years, we've continually adapted our work to respond to emerging issues and changing contexts. So in this regard, over the years, with the acceleration of digital technology and the internet becoming a new frontier for gendered violence and exploitation and child sexual abuse, it really became clear to us that we needed to contribute to efforts to address online violence against women. We focused our efforts on ending online sexual exploitation and abuse in its many forms, lending our gendered legal expertise and advocacy skills, and also mobilizing diverse stakeholders nationally and internationally to bring about solutions. With the growing levels of connectivity across all countries, and as more people spend time online, there is a growing pool of perpetrators and also a corresponding pool of potential victims. Perpetrators are taking advantage of the limited regulation, the borderless nature of the internet, and the anonymity of online space and camera-ready technology to exploit with increasing impunity. So as a result, sexual violence, sex trafficking, sexual extortion are flourishing alongside new forms of misogynistic cybercrime and abuse, such as deepfake imagery, cyber stalking, and live streaming of sexual violence against women and children. And I think, as we all know, online harm against women and girls does not occur in a vacuum. The internet does reflect real life. So the patriarchy and misogyny that flourishes in our physical space are being replicated and exacerbated online. Artificial intelligence and machine learning are enabled and allowed to amplify age-old biases that feed misogyny and racial and religious divisions. And these biases, as we know, exacerbate inequality, which disproportionately affects women and girls and makes them particularly vulnerable to online violence, discrimination, and violation of their rights. At Equality Now, we use what we call an ecosystems approach to achieving legal and systemic change. And this means that we seek to understand the different aspects of a problem, as well as the range of actors in the issue ecosystem. And we undertake intersectional feminist analysis and engagement so that we have a holistic understanding of what needs to change. So by using this approach in this context and talking to and engaging with women's rights organizations working on digital rights and children's rights online, UN agencies and regional bodies, lawyers, researchers, and survivors of online sexual exploitation, we learned that we needed to engage with other themes and other issues and areas of rights that are integral parts of the digital space ecosystem. And we identified 5 key areas. So firstly, looking at issues of internet governance and asking the questions, who's setting the rules, the norms and principles that shape the internet and digital technology? Do these rules, norms and principles work for all people, particularly women and girls everywhere? We also looked at the issue of the role and accountability of the digital space. So as we know, in addition to governments, the technology sector is playing a key role in designing and operating the platforms and tools that people are using to interact online, and their reach and influence is transcending national jurisdictions. Our human rights frameworks at the international level, as they are currently, are founded and operate on the premise that governments are the duty bearers. But however, considering the power that is wielded by the technology sector in the digital realm, we must be asking ourselves the questions: what is their role in protecting people's rights online? And what level of accountability should be expected of them at the international level? Another area that came out was the interaction between the right to safety and protection and other rights such as privacy and freedom of expression. And there are tensions in how these rights are upheld when they are interacting with each other in the digital space. And as a result, our conclusion was that we need to have a much more, to use an intersectional law, intersectional lens needs to be applied in this context. We also looked at the role and impact of artificial intelligence and machine learning in perpetuating and amplifying biases and discrimination. And we know that AI biases are perpetuating sexist and racist recruitment practices, gender and racial profiling by government agencies and businesses, and discrimination by machine learning systems that control and curate the information that we are fed. And then lastly, but not least, we also looked at the issue of the global and multi-jurisdictional nature of the digital space, and how and whether our current international legal principles and frameworks relating to issues of jurisdiction and international cooperation are applying effectively in the digital space. We came to the conclusion that actually current laws and legal systems at the international level and also across many countries have not kept pace with the digital advances, and that they are not fully equipped to deal with the realities of the digital world. These are multi-dimensional and very complex issues, but fundamentally what we are looking for is that all people, particularly those that are most vulnerable, should be protected from harm in online spaces and as a result of the use of digital technologies. Siloed national processes are really insufficient for these issues that are global and multi-jurisdictional. So our conviction at the end of all this is that we actually need an overarching international framework, such as the Universal Declaration on Digital Rights, that will articulate the rights of all people in the digital space, that will guarantee the protection of fundamental rights, and also regulate human interactions. And while some laws and regulations are being enacted, we cherish the fact that over 120 countries all over the world at the moment are enacting privacy legislation. But how digital rights can be conceived as fundamental rights through an international, universal, and binding tool is a necessary step for us.
Great, Tsitsi. We've got a couple of minutes left, or one actually, 1 minute, 1 or 2 minutes left. What is your vision for this Universal Declaration? What change do you want it to bring about?
So what we really want to see is a digital space where all people, particularly women and girls and other marginalized groups, can participate and express themselves without fear of violence and discrimination. A space where no one lives in fear of previous invasions and data breaches, a space where people can form reliable thoughts and opinions without the pollution of fake news, propaganda, and misinformation. We also want a digital space where no one has the fear of accessing a loan or insurance or a mortgage because of the color of their skin or their gender, and other biases that we see coming out of algorithms that governments and companies are relying on to make decisions. We want to see regulation so that those who infringe on the rights of others wherever they are located can be held accountable and don't take advantage of loopholes that currently exist to exploit with impunity. So I think in a nutshell, what we would like to see is equality, non-discrimination, and accountability in the digital space.
Great. So the same things in the physical world, in the digital world. Excellent.
Thank you.
Let me bring in Isra here. The Human Rights Council resolution on the promotion, protection, and enjoyment of human rights on the internet affirmed that the same rights people have offline must be protected online. So let me ask you, Isra, what are the international human rights laws that currently exist that address the need for digital rights? Where are the gaps in the law? And how would a universal declaration address these gaps?
Yeah, thank you so much, Nikki. And thanks, Cece, for your comments earlier. I think one thing that was made very clear from Cece's comments is that we can't separate digital rights from human rights, right? As the Human Rights Resolution said, the rights that we enjoy offline are the same rights that we should enjoy online. So when we have issues of hate speech and content moderation, privacy, these are things that existed before the internet and are merely being exacerbated by business models that profit, that put profits over people. So starting from that framework, you know, we can look at really what exists internationally to hold accountability for the harms that occur online. And you know, a starting point, honestly, is with the current international human rights instruments we have, going even back to the UDHR, so the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. We see there that the rights of freedom of expression, to privacy, those are fundamental rights that we've already acknowledged and agreed are rights that deserve protection. And those things also apply when we talk about digital rights, right? So we see that things like freedom of expression and privacy play out in a very different way online than they have historically offline. But as Cece mentioned, sometimes the online harms we see, of course, translates to offline harms. So when it comes to, you know, how to hold actors accountable for abuses in that area, and I think one thing we have to remember is the speed at which technology moves and the speed at which lawmaking moves, and they're very, very different things. You know, we hear that, I've heard a lot the saying that we have laws from the 19th century been implemented by lawmakers from the 20th century on technologies from the 21st century. So by the time we, you know, sit down and discuss issues of, you know, what does artificial intelligence mean, machine learning, by the time we have those conversations, the technology will look very different than it did when we began. So I think that when we talk about methods of accountability, we should really think about how we can use existing instruments as, you know, not the ceiling, but as a floor for where to begin with looking at accountability, because we can't afford to wait, you know, for decades or however long it takes for the international community to agree on language, on form, because we see harms occurring every day. So, you know, there are, of course, national laws on privacy, expression and so forth that can apply. At the international level yet, you know, we still haven't seen anything strong and binding that's specifically on digital rights. But the instruments that we found that have been useful so far are things like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, things that look maybe not so much quite as state action, but as the private sector action, because it's really impossible to talk about digital rights without talking about the private sector, right? That gives us access to the internet, that gives us the platforms that we browse when we're online. I think all of us have become much more aware of that over the last 2 years, where we're doing this by Zoom, and essentially the way that we work, that we socialize, that we get information is now increasingly in the hands of the private sector. So for me, I honestly think that looking more at private sector accountability gets us fairly far in the discussion on digital rights.
So you started out by saying business models that put profits over people is problematic. What is the role of corporations? Where do you believe these responsibilities lie for them?
Well, under the UN Guiding Principles, you know, with the framework of protect, respect, and remedy, where states are called to protect human rights and corporations are called to respect, and also to provide remedy where there are harms. I see the responsibility lies there. So we have we have companies in the tech sector, from telecom companies to big tech platforms to small firms that that most of us haven't heard of, that all have a role to play here. So I think it starts from the very beginning. The UNGPs talk about human rights impact assessment and due diligence, and this is all the more important when we talk about technology. Another one of the phrases that is very popular in the tech world that I'm sure many of you have heard is move fast and break things, right? The Facebook mantra of you create and then you think about the consequences afterwards. But for technology, we really the role of accountability there is for companies to think right from the beginning, before you start implementing different tools and technologies, to think about the impacts that it will have on human rights. So doing due diligence right from the beginning, from the development stage and not just deployment, and throughout the life cycle of a product. And I think it's also important to think about the role that tech companies have, the disparate impact they have around the world. So when I talk about the tech sector, we're mainly talking about a handful of companies from California, from Silicon Valley. And yet the impacts we see go way past the US, right? Facebook is always a great company to pick on, but Facebook, we see that most Facebook users are not in the US, right? We have Facebook users are spread out all over the world, and yet they pour more resources into the US, and whereas in other parts of the world, Facebook is not just a tool for socialization, it is the internet. So I think that we need to ensure that the home jurisdictions of these companies are enacting laws that keep their power in check, but also that these companies are really taking a good look at where their impacts really are. So that we don't end up having, essentially different kinds of rights for people based on where they are. So that Facebook users, Google users in the US are afforded the same rights as Google users in Myanmar or in Ethiopia or in the Philippines. So I think we really need to look at the breadth and the wide reach of tech companies and ensure that all users, regardless of where in the world they're based, are being afforded the same protections and the same respect of their human rights.
Thank you very much. I mean, to summarize, I suppose I can't really summarize all of that, but having a digital rights, equality, and no harm by design would be a sort of simple tagline to sort of summarize some of that. I know that the Web Foundation has been doing a lot of work in this area. So I wonder, Nena, if you could tell us a bit about that. The Web Foundation has promoted the contract for the web. What does it mean? What does it actually do, and how does it work? What are the principles that underpin it?
Hello, everyone, and thanks, Nikki, for having me again. Web Foundation Contract for the Web launched its principles in 2018. But for those who've been around for some time, in 2014, Dilma Rousseff of Brazil signed the Marco Civil da Internet on the eve of Girls in Tech. It was an April like this in 2014. I was there, Sir Tim Berners-Lee was there, and Vincef was there. So there has always been that urge to have digital rights enshrined into law in a framework that is constraining. And so in 2019, when Sir Tim Berners-Lee launched the contract for the web, it was to serve as a policy guide. There are 9 principles, and the underpinning was very simple. The same that underpinned the World Wide Web and the Web Foundation for that matter, that the digital space will be open, safe, secure, and hashtag for everyone. I think that you couldn't have anything more feminist than that. So the contract for the web has 9 principles, 3 principles for government, 3 for industry, and 3 for civil society or users. It is really very important, like my sisters have said, that we realize that everyone has a role to play. And it is, I recall that what Sir Tim Berners-Lee said at that time is that if we spend so much of our time online, it is time we also be responsible for it. It is not enough to make money. It is not enough to have users. It is not enough to regulate, but there should be a sense of responsibility in the framework of global digital commons. So in a very small, short and sweet way, the contract for the web are 9 principles, policy principles for all of the actors engaging us on our responsibility. What have we learned from it? I've been there from day one. What we've learned from it is that Web Foundation is the right organization to do this because we are cross. We have the legacy and the spirit of the World Wide Web. So we can only be ourselves in doing this. The other thing we learned is that multi-stakeholderism is better than multilateralism. And maybe we can come back to that. Having the big guys sit together is very easy, but having everyone who has a stake have a voice is better. The other lesson we've learned is that multi-stakeholderism is being challenged by the day. I think someone has said it here. Once there is a bit of disorder, even what we've gained in digital rights, it's very easy to lose all our gains, that the things we fought for, whether it's in feminist rights or digital rights. Once there's a bit of crisis, like what we have today in Ukraine, it's just blown away. And so if we don't have a framework where we all agree, governments, industry, civil society, then we will be losing by the day. It will be very easy to say, oh, China and the US has agreed, the UK and the EU have agreed. You know, we should move beyond that because that is not the spirit of the internet. It is always that everyone should be able to be part of it. Everyone should be able to co-create. Everyone should be able to bring in and take something out. So it's still a huge challenge to have all stakeholders at the table. The last lesson we've learned, to my dear legal practitioners, we all know that that's the first thing you learn in law school. The law is subject to politics. Adopting is one thing, implementing is another thing, right? Everybody can endorse overnight. Everybody can say A, everybody can vote for. But then once the voting is done, what happens next? How do we monitor it? How do we implement it? What is the accountability framework for this? And that is one thing I'd like to put to you, Nikki, as our moderator. As we move forward with this big dream, the question will be, how do we know that we are doing what we said we will do? I will stop so far.
Thank you. How might this contract for the web contribute to a global framework, you know, such as the Global Compact that the UN SG suggested at the CSW this year, or indeed the Universal Declaration on Digital Rights that we're proposing? How might this global contract inform that?
And so 50% of my time at the Web Foundation is actually dedicated to the UN and UN stuff. Yes, I know it's boring. Yes, I know it's the same thing. Yes, yes, yes. But hey, the UN is what we have now, and we don't have anything better than it. And so while we are still working to get something better than the UN, we have the UN to deal with. The UN has launched something called the Digital Cooperation Agenda. It was about the same time we were launching the contract for the web. And so Guterres speaks with the inventor of the web, Sir Tim Berners-Lee, and says, I see what you're doing with the contract for the web, and I think that it can be helpful to the digital cooperation agenda. And we said, hey, why not? We have the same objectives, let's get into it. The Global Digital Compact is part of the agenda for rebuilding after the pandemic. It is a 7-point plan that has one, connecting everyone, including schools, avoiding fragmentation, protecting data, applying human rights online, friends, And then accountability for misleading content online. We've talked about it. Regulation of AI and digital commons as a global good. It does not solve all of our problems. The Global Digital Compact is not something new. The idea that the UN Tech Envoy has is that it will borrow from ongoing processes like what we have and what we're discussing now, like the contract for the web, like the open-ended working group on cybersecurity. There are a lot of things coming together, and they're like, yeah, let's put these 7 pillars together. Let's agree on something. For those who've been around for some time, the last time we agreed on any digital plan, it's called Tunis Plan, and that was in 2005. That was 17 years ago. This is an unprecedented time in history for the UN to realize that digital cooperation is something very important. I do know that there are 7 pillars, and I respect the 7 pillars. But ladies, as an African woman in West Africa, I'd like to stress the gender responsiveness of this. And that is why the Web Foundation will be holding consultations across the world to ensure that voices of people who are otherwise not heard will be heard this time. We are bent on it. It's work I'm going to do this year, next year. I don't know if all my dreams are going to come true, but hey, what is it? I'm going to fight for my dreams until my battle is done. And while I'm doing that, I'll be raising other people to fight alongside. So even if I don't live to see the Universal Declaration of Digital Rights, even if I don't live to see that access to meaningful connectivity becomes a right, ladies, please keep on this battle. It is worth it. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you very much. It's a rallying cry there, and a challenge to us all on how are we going to ensure multi-stakeholder engagement and inclusivity in making sure that we are ensuring that the global digital commons is in fact a good space for everybody, and that any declaration that is adopted is actually implemented with that in mind, that this is a global digital commons, and it has to be doing good. I think that's a great challenge to us all. I haven't got the answers for you, Nena, but we will bear it in mind as we move forward. Thank you very much. One of the things we've been talking about is, this need for intersectionality, the inclusion, a feminist formed universal declaration. So Chennai, why is it important to look at digital rights with an intersectional feminist lens? And what would a feminist approach look like? How might it inform how digital rights are framed and understood?
Thank you, Nikki. And thank you so much to my fellow panelists who've actually set the stage and talking about like the variety in the discourse on this issue. I think one thing to note in starting this conversation is the fact that feminism as language and a word elicits 2 responses: either excitement that, this is something that's going to give us an opportunity to be critical and really unpack nuances and issues, or a complete shutdown and a context of people literally saying, just like remove the feminists from the conversation. Why are we having this? So it's really exciting for me that we're having this conversation and actually naming feminist principles and approaches as a way to addressing the issues that we have at hand. So to begin with, I think it's important to frame what we mean by intersectionality, right, in this context. And intersectionality in its historical terms was actually a term that was coined by Kimbell Crenshaw, and then the works done by Patricia Hill Collins to actually unpack other areas it exists in, and also an African framing that recently was unpacked in Dr. Sylvia Tamale's work on Afrofeminist futures. And one of the ways that I've actually conceptualized intersectionality, or taken from the different players to understand it in the context of technology, is that it's an understanding of social interactions with technology that consider multiple inequalities and locate technology in the context of systematic oppression, which includes racism, sexism, colonialism, classism, and patriarchy. So when we understand that people actually experience inequality in these layered perspectives, we take an approach to solutions that considers itself intersectional. We're not just fighting for marginalized groups and put a blanket term, or we're not just saying women and then everybody has access to the issues at hand, but it's really understanding the experiences that in our diversity as a Black woman located in South Africa, interacting on a global stage, the way that I interact with technology is going to be completely different from a white woman who's located in the global north and the way that they interact with the technology. So it's really important that we nuance this in conversations around rights and in conversations around seeking social justice and equality. So in that instance, I really think it's important to locate intersectionality also in that conversation. I'm going to take a quote from Sylvia Tamale, where she says, while Africans are adversely affected by enduring legacies of colonialism and its convergence with racism, our positioning within diverse social categories based on gender, ethnicity, class, sexuality, disability, religion, age, marital status, and so forth, mean we experience oppression differently. So I think that's the point that I want to couch in emphasizing why it's important to have an intersectional feminist lens in thinking about digital rights. And it's not just about women, it's also a lens that allows us to critique at a systematic and structural level the issues that will then have an impact for everyone, men, women, gender diverse people, people in sexual minorities, and children. So then this is the part of contextualizing what we mean by an intersectional feminist lens. And so if I just want to close on this one, I think in thinking about like what it would mean to have an intersectional feminist lens, a feminist approach is really the ability to unpack a spectrum of issues and opportunities that are found within the context of digital technology. So it's not just the bad things, but also the opportunities of how we can then use the technology and our different intersectional points, and also focus on centering agency and structure of people, and then also nuancing the power dynamics that are existent from everyone who's participating in the space.
That's great. So how might a feminist informed Universal Declaration of Rights address these issues and prepare us for a digital future? I mean, looking at that particular tool of the Universal Declaration.
Sure. Thanks, Nikki. So I think the way that it would do that is it would actually think about locating the Universal Declaration in areas of context, right? Not everyone is excited for Human Rights Declaration. Oftentimes people want to have instruments that are reflective of their community and their praxis. So then by locating that, taking on a feminist lens, it allows for us to set up the conversation in context and ensure that we have a framework that can be translated and localized in different areas, right? And then I think it also, you know, Tsitsi mentioned an ecosystem approach in designing the process and thinking about it. And I think this allows for, by taking on a feminist approach, we're able to have a layered conversation of the different players in the room, from corporate to government to individual to civil society, and really thinking about like what extent can we engage with this tool at those different layers and then nuance them in the positions that they're entering the conversations into. And I think it's also really allows us to have a tool where we can critique innovation, right? And I really like the point that Isidore had raised around kind of like where the jurisdiction of these companies that are implementing technologies are versus the actual users creates this difference in experience for people, because who's valued in the conversation. So having that feminist lens for thinking about the Universal Declaration actually allows for us to be critical about innovation, not just with big tech, but even with local tech developers, because then we can hold them accountable to actually say, look, there's this Universal Declaration. If you're going to implement something that you think is going to address a developmental issue, to what extent have you taken on these issues around digital rights? Because most of the times people are innovating in context of actually responding to the global north, because that's where the money is. And I think with what Nina had mentioned around the contract of the web, by taking on that feminist framing on Universal Declaration, the principles that are guiding it and working within institutions that are often responded to in multilateral spaces that lead to decisions and regulations being put in place, we're actually able to have language that allows for change and that allows for people to actually then be able to hold those multilateral institutions and governments accountable whenever they implement any policy or regulations in their perspective.
Thank you very much. There's really, really good insight into why we need to be intersectional in our approach to this. And that's about being critical of and when there is innovation, to make sure it works for everybody, that it does no harm, that there is that it's taking into account different needs across the world. I wonder if, Anna, if we can move on now to looking at artificial intelligence, data and privacy, because these are some of the issues that will come up as we engage in such a critique. There are some really big issues in digital space. What are some of the debates and disruptions that we're facing in the fields of AI, data and privacy online? And what's the impact on people's rights? And if you could take that from an intersectional perspective, that would be fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I'm blown away from sort of what I've heard so far. I have to be honest, it's really good. And it's a debate that we really must have. And I particularly really enjoy the sort of the arguments being brought so far. So in order to tackle this issue, I'm just going to touch on something that was mentioned earlier. So I think over the last few years, we have seen, but first of all, we've seen some of the best of technology, but we've seen some of the very worst happening. And a lot of this relates to artificial intelligence and automation, where we have really seen the automation as we know of inequality and poverty by means of algorithmic discrimination. We have seen stereotypes being coded in machines, making decisions and predictions about human beings. And we have seen the use of predictive technologies basically turning into self-fulfilling prophecies rather than by coding existing data into algorithms. And data is certainly not neutral. Data is picture of society as it is now, therefore represents years and centuries of inequalities. And even the process of deciding, which data goes into a database and which data goes outside of the database is never a neutral choice. It's a choice that somebody who is in a position of power is making this choice that, for example, I have to go in a database and somebody doesn't have to go in the database. And this is something that it could be an act of violence. It could be an act of so there is violence within data. There is this sort of that can happen. And this is one of the reasons why we are seeing within artificial intelligence a lot of harm and potential harm that can happen in particular to the most vulnerable in society, to women. And this is something that is being raised a lot over the last few years. We have also seen that artificial intelligence is not just about technology and it's not just about data, it's very much about power. And this is why this is very much of a feminist issue that we have to deal with. And this is because the way that we're talking about artificial intelligence is often in terms of a race between superpowers, between China, the US, between and we've also seen artificial intelligence and big data being turned into a new form of digital colonialism, where there is a lot of exploitation of data, in particular in nations that are financially more poorer, but they have a resource rich when the resource is actually not oil or not, but it is data. So we are seeing artificial intelligence turning into this sort of new form of power grab, and because we're talking about power grab, then we are this is why we want to come in with an intersectional feminist approach, because this is exactly what we need to tackle. I wanted to say one thing, that a lot of these issues that we're talking about are very much intertwined. It's very difficult to talk about privacy in the digital without talking about competition. As Edward mentioned, when we talk about technology, we talk about a small number of players. This is why it's very difficult to separate in the digital ecosystem the issues around privacy, the issues around from competition, antitrust, and the online monopolies that we have in the digital ecosystem right now. So all these issues are very much intertwined. The other point that I wanted to make, Nikki, is that across the world, we are seeing some really big convergence around, for example, privacy, and I'll come to that in a minute, but we have seen some very profound differences. And this is where the politics around all this come forward. So the convergence that we're seeing, for example, in sort of declarations around digital rights. So we're seeing, for example, the Europe is putting forward a declaration around digital rights, which should inform digital transformation. We've seen Biden making similar comments in the US. We've seen privacy becoming a fundamental right in Brazil. We have seen 120 privacy laws being enacted all around the world. We have seen principles governing artificial intelligence being enacted in Australia as very rooted in human rights, as well as in Singapore with the FATE principles. So we are seeing some convergence happening across the globe on this matter. On the same situations though, we're also seeing some profound divergence. The profound divergence that we're seeing at the moment in the world of data and digitization is around digital sovereignty and around localization, okay? And this is not a good sign. And it's not a good sign because on the one hand, it's really, really important that countries can leverage the data that they produce, right, rather than have this data exploited by others. But on the other hand, the language of sovereignty is a language that is difficult to decouple with wider political issues, which are perhaps only going to be exacerbated by the current political situation that we're seeing at global level, especially with the Russia invasion of Ukraine. The reason why I'm seeing all this is because what I heard in everyone's today is really that, you know, the complete link and strong link between the global politics and political situation and what we're trying to achieve here, you know, which is the idea that we want to enshrine into a tool a set of digital rights that apply, that are sort of that emerge from an intersectional feminist approach to the digital ecosystem, which reflect the rights that we do already have in the real world we live in, but they are to an extent the product of discussions that realize that the digital world is not the same as the physical world, although the two are going to be merged more and more. And with artificial intelligence, I think this has become extremely clear that this is the case, because artificial intelligence so far has demonstrated one of the things that we always knew as women, which is that technology is not neutral, that when data is ingested into these machines, this data is not neutral. And therefore, if we want, for example, algorithms to be fair, there has to be a political choice for the outputs of algorithms to be fair. It's not going to happen by nature. So one of the important things is that artificial intelligence, just to sum up on what you were asked, artificial intelligence has really demonstrated all of this, the non-neutrality of technology, the non-neutrality of data, and the fact that over the last few years, by basically living in this sort of ideology of datafication, this ideology of, you know, data is great and data can even replace politics, replace policy. We don't need it, you know, because we've got data which informs us. For women, and that it hasn't been great, has it? You know, because data is so we've come to realize all of this, I think, around the globe, and it's really important that we have the conversations in the way that Chennai was really saying it. I was really completely in agreement, you know, in a way that then can inform sort of local policy making, local discussions. So rather than, because we're not here to, this is why we need this, and we're not here to, we don't want to impose anything. It's really a matter of empowering communities at local level to then define and translate into legislation how this, or all of this really.
Thank you very much. That's a very compelling argument there, Ivana. How might feminist informed Universal Declaration on Rights, how would this declaration itself address these issues, do you think? And how would it prepare us for a digital future? It will, because I mean, I've been thinking, Nikki, that, you know, well, you know, we have the Declaration of Human Rights, we have a set of tools, and is Edward's right, you know, we have to leverage what we've got already, and we do. I mean, the sort of privacy, for example, privacy law, with all the differences and nuances that we can have at local level. But if I think about it, over the last few years, with algorithmic discrimination, which has really coded discrimination and inequality into algorithms that's deciding what we see, what we look at, what we decide, whether we're going to receive a loan or not, very often
the principles of algorithm of fairness in data, for example, of privacy, very often the issue around, you know, the accuracy of data collection. These principles, they have been the one informing what Isadora was saying, you know, saying leveraging privacy law to stop the harm of algorithmic decision making. We have seen this happening, but that is not enough. That won't be enough, because you and me, and we can end up in a situation where an algorithm does not process individual personal data at all, and yet has a major impact on individuals and on communities, because privacy is very much of an individual right. But actually, the language of individual rights may not be sufficient anymore. We may have to look at group rights. We may have to look at privacy in a different way. So the issue is all this may not be sufficient. So the way that this would help is to codify in clear terms that although we live in a world where we are somewhere in the middle between being online and not being online, and it's increasingly going to be more like that with the metaverse, artificial intelligence, reality, virtual reality, how we're going to be augmented. Nevertheless, we have to fully familiarize with what it means to be a digital citizen in the digital ecosystem. This is why I would very much like to see sort of a set of clear principles and rights being codified, enshrined in very clearly, related to the digital ecosystem and how we translate what we have already into the digital ecosystem, because that exercise is extremely useful, especially where we move towards a world of increased merge between the two worlds. Without that exercise, I feel that, you know, it's not going to be enough, and particularly from a feminist perspective, as you know, and this is why I strongly believe that, you know, it is really the time to go through this process.
Thank you very much, Ivana. And I think it's a really interesting balance in the language you use and the language that Nena was using about the global commons, and the idea of a global commons and digital citizens' rights. I think is really, really quite important to get your head around. I think that also that leveraging existing national and international laws will be part of what needs to happen. We need to look at how can we apply the Universal Declaration on Human Rights in digital space. We need to look at how we can apply CEDAW and look at arguing and lobbying for general recommendations to different international treaties. But you know, I for one agree with you that a Universal Declaration on Digital Rights that lays down the principles of the way forward is really critical to this management of the relationship between digital citizens and the global commons. And it's very fast changing space. This global commons is really, really changing really, really fast because of the speed of technology, the speed of the internet itself, and the speed of which people are adopting it as a way of interacting with each other, way of doing business, way of education, the way of socialization. It's part of nearly everything we do now, and more and more and more so. So I want to thank all of the panelists. I think it was a really, really interesting conversation so far, and I would like to invite Amanda and Tsitsi to help me out here. They've been monitoring questions that are coming up online, and I think they're going to read them out so that you can hear them, and then I will we'll work out between us which of you will be best suited to answer, or you can volunteer. So Tsitsi and Amanda, would you like to let us know what's been happening in the chat?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nikki. So yeah, there are several questions that have come through. One of them is, my query is about the politics of getting this new instrument now. Do you have a sense of the interest among states currently to take forward such a proposal? The gender ideology critics are pretty strong right now. So it's a question around, you know, state interest.
Okay, would someone like to volunteer? I know Ivana mentioned some of the different parties that are interested. Maybe Nena, would you like to respond to that one? I'll put you on the spot, or somebody else step up.
Okay, I smiled at the question because I do recall being activist, highly active in the Nigerian Freedom of Information law. It took us 13 years. I was just a fresh graduate. By the time it finished, I had gained 20 kilos more in weight. Yeah, so it took it took that long for the Nigerian government to sign that bill into law. We also started another one, I think 8 years ago, digital rights in Nigeria, a code for digital rights. After 5 years, the president did not assent to it. And so we are still on it. I don't know how long it's going to take. Now, if we're looking for something global, okay, so take that at the national level and multiply it times the 193 member states of the UN, right? Then you can see how difficult it's going to be. However, we've already come, we've made progress, right? When Frank LaRue, sorry, was the rapporteur on rights, he did submit a report that let the UN understand that access to the internet was the bedrock, was the driver for all other rights. Okay, so and then he put out key pillars for digital rights. I did talk about the Marco Civil of 2014. Later on, people saw what happened in Brazil. It hasn't been easy. Even today, Marco Civil is still under attack. Ivana, I might remind you that there was a time the Italian parliament actually wanted to run something similar. I did work on it. I've been around for some time. I'm saying this because been there, seen it, done that. So I'm asking myself, how are we best situated to make this happen? So the UN did appoint a tech envoy. They didn't stay long. We're waiting for the appointment of another tech envoy. We are waiting for the summit of the future. What we have is a compact. It is not a charter. It is not a code that everyone agrees. You know how it works at the UN. By the time they start selling and buying language, but I do believe that a compact is something that we can measure, that we can hold states accountable to. And you also notice that not everything is there. Not everything is there. We've carefully picked only 7 pillars. Well, maybe I would say let's begin with those. But then my answer is simple. It's not going to be an easy task, but if we don't do it, no one will. So let's get to the task, no matter how long it's going to take.
Thank you very much. Should we move on to another question, Tsitsi?
Yes, so how do we ensure that in the development of a universal declaration, we do not only respond to global North challenges and human rights infringements, but ensure that all people's interests are protected? And I think that was sort of a running theme through some of the panelists' presentations. Yeah, but over to you, Nikki, in terms of elaboration.
Isadora, would you like to respond to that one?
Yeah, sure, I can respond to this. And I see that there was another question that's along the same lines of ensuring that as well. Yeah, that users in different jurisdictions have the same rights. So I will say that I am a little bit pessimistic about state action, to be honest. The unfortunate trend that we're seeing is that rather than enacting laws that protect and promotes rights online, the governments are starting to see the benefit of basically putting their hands in the pot of all the data that companies are collecting, right? So things that, and enacting laws that end up forcing companies to pass data through their jurisdictions and basically do other things that give the governments a bit more control over people's data. So honestly, I think that one way we should focus more attention on is on direct action with the private sector. That includes the direct advocacy to the companies themselves. You know, over the last few years, we've seen the growth of things like human rights policies and statements coming from companies. So I think this is an opportunity for us as civil society to leverage that, to use it to hold companies to the same standards across the different jurisdictions that they work in. So, you know, in addition to that, you know, we still see, like I mentioned earlier, the ways that governments are pushing the boundaries of control over companies in ways that end up hindering rights. And I think that we can really use that as a way to push the private sector to push back against those sorts of requests. If anyone has the resources and the power to do so, it's the private sector. And then finally, I would say that an interesting growth that we've seen over the last few years is an increasing interest by investors, by responsible investors, to take into account not just ESG, so like environmental, social, and governance, but also human rights issues as well. So when we have people who have, you know, direct influence over the way companies behave, that are starting to understand things like human rights, and particularly the impacts that companies have in different jurisdictions around the world, I think that's another way of pushing change. So while we wait for states to catch up and do the right thing, I think there's opportunity for us to ask for these things directly from the companies themselves.
Thank you very much. And I wonder, Chennai, if you had something to add to that before we move on to the next question? Or...
I was looking for my unmute button. But I think in terms of, you know, like Isidore has actually just said everything, but I also wanted to add another layer where I think there's a need to also be quite accountable as civil society, who are often advocating within these conversations, the ones who are actually often holding space or have access to the people who make the decisions, and who usually private sector, when it's actually convening on a particular topic, the first people that reach out is civil society to get them into the room. So in addition to that, in terms of like ensuring the same rights regardless of jurisdiction, it's also a need for civil society that holds space and power in terms of being either a funder or in terms of either being in the US or in the UK, because they're closer to those people, to actually then also make sure that they ensure space for everyone to be fully represented and meaningfully represented, so that we move away from a practice of extractionist, with those who actually occupy the spaces where, you know, like Facebook can quickly pick up the phone and have a conversation with them, and not just like calling people who are based on the African continent or in Southeast Asia or in Latin America, and actually, you know, just getting that input without creating a space for meaningful contribution and meaningful collaboration. And I think when we take on that intersectional lens, it means that we're also quite critical of our own practices to ensure that, you know, local people are quite represented in the conversation as well.
Thank you very much. Tsitsi, have we've got time for another question?
Yes, so this is asking, how can we start the process of truly democratizing data? For example, who collects data and controls it, who gains from it, and the insights that are generated through data gathering? How can people be best represented and ensure that their the voice is heard and included?
I think that's one for Ivana.
I'm on mute. Sorry, it's a really interesting question. I mean, in terms of, I mean, there are different angles to this. Very briefly, one is in terms of making sure that when data is fed into algorithms, making decisions about us, and there is due process and due diligence there. And this is a really important thing, because at the moment, we don't know who is going to actually check that. So, you know, if we take the data as it is and we ingest it feed it into algorithms, then the outcome and the output, if it's a decision, is not going to be automatically fair, because, you know, data is simply the picture of society. So if we want this to be fair, then there is a responsibility, as was mentioned earlier, of all companies and corporations doing all this. But there is also a responsibility of decision of policymakers to have the clear guidance in place, so the clear policies and procedures in place so they can verify that a product is not biased and doesn't produce biased outcomes when it goes before it goes into market. So there's a lot of developments happening globally. There are standards being developed. There are draft legislation happening all around the world around artificial intelligence, from China to the US and Europe. Nevertheless, at the moment, one thing that we can be sure of is that at the moment there is no process before a product goes into the market that says, well, yes, I mean, this algorithm has been vetted and it does not discriminate. It has it has a mark on it, saying that that is okay. That safeguards sort of gender rights or whatever. How difficult that is. So this is one thing, and of course, having a more inclusive design and participation is a very important step. So that's why, having sort of more diversity into the actual sort of coding these systems is really, very important, but it's not the only thing. On the wider issue around democratizing data, I think it's very important to understand that data is a public value. We have seen that data can really be important because it can inform us in many different ways. However, I think it's really important to realize that data is a public good, and this is the reason why it has to be protected and safeguarded, and this is the reason why privacy matters, not because of an individual culture, but because data is so important for the public good. I mean, to an extent, there is nothing more valuable for the community than a piece of personal information. This is why we've got to safeguard it and not having it manipulated. Things like data cooperatives or data trust, forms of collective ways of handling data are very, very important. In particular, what I think is really important is ways that enable the individual to decide, how generous they want to be with their data, but also ways that do not put the individuals constantly having to assess whatever they do. Because I mean, we live in a world where, every time that we open a web page, we got inundated with privacy notices, privacy policies. Do you agree with this? Don't you agree with this? I mean, people are not going to read that because it's just deceitful by design, that rather than being private by design. It has a lot of dark patterns and nudging to make you do and choose, the thing that it wanted to choose. So I think it's really about, identifying ways to ensure that, we can have that control over our data, decide whether we want it to share or not, but not being put into the situation where we have to, the entire onus has to be on us as individuals, because that is not going to work. There are interesting, experiments happening. So, for example, in the EU, you have the Data Act and the Data Governance Act. It's all about, safely sharing data between sectors, between organizations, in order to further research and to further progress. The best way to do that, however, is to experiment, in my view, with things like collective ways of hosting and having control over data.
Excellent, thank you very much. And as you were speaking, Chennai put up a notice saying she's working on something around in this area. I wonder if, Chennai, you want to add to Ivana's thoughts there?
Yeah, so I think for me, it's always been really trying to figure out in this conversation what collective action looks like. How do we then get people to be part of this conversation? Because oftentimes, like when you ask people, like, what do you care about your data and your privacy? It's like, well, why should I? I've got nothing to hide. It's not that you don't have anything to hide, but your data is very valuable to someone and to some entities, and that's how you see things, working in a way that don't necessarily benefit you. So for me, this project that's been supported by Internews is building up on work that I previously did as a Mozilla Fellow, where it was really trying to assess the way in which AI privacy and data protection were being framed in South Africa from a gender and sexuality perspective. And then you see that usually it's kind of like this framework of once we have everyone protected, that we don't nuance the issues of people who already likely susceptible to injustice in society. society. And so then this is one of those projects where it's really trying to figure out how do we raise the voices of people who actually actively work towards social structure and social change at that level, which is African feminists, and then, begin to tie into that conversation of it's not just a digital space on its own, it's really connected to everything. So how then do we lend the work we're already doing in other areas of social justice into the data space for us to then be able to hold governments accountable when they put in these fantastic new laws that they're putting in, but like, let's be more critical about it. And when, organizations roll out new technology under the guise of this is going to be a developmental solution, but yet it's also quite extractive in the data that's being collected and the new products that are going to be launched.
Excellent. And that's a good articulation of why Equality Now and Women Leading AI have joined hands in this program, because we work on laws and social change, and Women Leading AI are very involved in ethics and the world of the internet, and we've got a lot to learn from each other, which is really exciting. And really great speakers today, really complex issues, and I've tasked Sitsi with trying to wrap up the session. So that's mean of me, but anyway. So Sitsi, I want to thank all the speakers. I think it's been a really rich conversation, and I know there are many more conversations to be had as we go forward. Sitsi, would you like to sort of take us towards the close of the meeting?
Yeah, thank you, Nikki. It's really been a fantastic conversation, and many thanks to our speakers, to Isidore, Nena, Chennai, Ivana, and their organizations and networks who are working every day to make the digital space a safer place for all of us. And we really hope that this webinar has given some of us insights into the challenges and of course the opportunities that we have to really look at this issue moving forward. I think the session today has really laid bare for all of us that, for our generation and for future ones, we really need to lay the foundations for an inclusive digital economy and society that will work for everyone, and that we really need to focus our energies on building and implementing these frameworks at the global level that will enable us to use digital technology to build better lives and to have a much more equal, peaceful, and trusting world. And for us as Equality Now and our partners, Women Leading in AI, we really believe that a bold and transformative universal declaration will provide us with that opportunity to move forward and to fulfill, the Sustainable Development Goal mantra of leaving no one behind. And that, we feel that we should really be guided by these principles of equality by design, freedom from discrimination, everyone's right to a progressive future, accountability, and so on. At Equality Now, we know from our experience that these are very complex issues, and that to deal with complexity, we need to address it from hearing from a wide range of perspectives, which is why our partnership with Women Leading in AI is so critical to this work. We need more of you to join us. We really need to be bringing together minds to move this forward. So, experts in gender, intersectionality, feminism, human rights, digital law, all the various areas that we are hearing about today from across the world. So if you're interested in joining us, please reach out. I'll ask my colleagues to put our email addresses in the chat. We would really be delighted to hear from you and work together, hear your thoughts as we take this campaign forward for a universal declaration on digital rights. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Tsitsi. And if you've got the questions that you've been sending, we will try and respond to in some way and get back to you. But please do reach out with other questions for ourselves or for any of our panelists. Please do, and we'll let's make sure this dialogue grows. the more conversations, the more people that get involved, the better it will be. Intersectionality matters, and it is a global digital commons. It matters to all of us. We need open, safe, secure space that is there for everyone. And we need to make sure that it's not used in a way that undermines people's dignity or their rights. Thank you very much, everybody. We're finishing dead on time. How clever of us. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.